It began, as world endings often do, with the ordinary hum of a morning that thought itself safe. Radios played the same news bulletins, televisions flickered with soap operas and baseball scores, and the newspapers were already old before they hit the front steps. In Moscow, Washington, London, and Beijing, bureaucrats moved through polished hallways, insulated from the idea that history could shatter in an hour. Yet all it took was one signal, one human decision under impossible pressure, to push the Cold War from a tense chess match into a blazing funeral pyre for civilization. The late 20th century was a world addicted to brinkmanship. The United States and the Soviet Union, swollen with ideological certainty and nuclear warheads, had stared at each other over an iron curtain of suspicion for decades. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had shown just how close both sides could come to annihilation without actually stepping off the cliff. War planners spoke of mutually assured destruction as though it were a guarantee of safety, a grim kind of peace built on the logic that no one would dare press the button if both would die. But deterrence was a fragile promise, balanced on the fallibility of human beings, their egos, and their fears. In our history, there were moments when the knife almost slipped. Petrov's decision in 1983 not to report a false alarm, Able Archer exercises misread as real invasion plans, misfired missiles mistaken for attack. In this alternate history, the mistake is not caught in time. The warning lights in a Soviet bunker are not dismissed. The coded messages from Moscow are read as confirmation, and the officers with keys in their hands follow the protocol drilled into them since the first days of their service. The missiles are launched. In the first 20 minutes, the sky over the northern hemisphere becomes a map of contrails and fire. In the United States, the early warning systems detect the launches and return fire before the first warheads even touch the atmosphere over Alaska. Across the Atlantic, NATO command orders retaliatory strikes on Warsaw Pact targets, even as European capitals brace for impact. Washington, Moscow, London, Paris, and Berlin, names that had stood for centuries, are consumed in nuclear light before most of their citizens understand that a war has begun. In those opening hours, no one truly commands the war. The automated systems, long feared for their inability to distinguish between signal and noise, take over much of the killing. Submarines, unable to reach their commanders through disrupted communications, unleash their payloads according to contingency plans drafted in another age. Bombers cross the polar skies with orders sealed in steel briefcases, flying towards cities that no longer exist by the time they arrive. The first day of the hot Cold War ends with perhaps a third of the global population dead or dying. Yet it is only the beginning. For those who survive the initial strikes, the real war is not between nations anymore. It is between humanity and the poisoned planet it has made. Firestorms consume forests and cities alike, casting soot into the upper atmosphere where it will choke the sunlight for years. Temperatures plummet, crops fail, and the supply chains that fed billions collapse overnight. This alternate history does not belong to generals and presidents alone. It belongs to the farmers who watch their soil freeze in midsummer, to the doctors performing surgeries by candlelight, to the children who will never see the stars because the sky is a permanent bruise of ash. It belongs to the small communities that learn, too late, how fragile the threads of modern life truly are. The Cold War was always described as a war that stayed cold because no one could survive its heat. But here, the world learned what it meant for that cold to boil over. And in the ruins of that lesson, scattered across continents, survivors will begin to write a new story, one born not of superpower rivalry, but of desperate resilience in the shadow of fire. History rarely pivots on inevitability. It pivots on moments, accidents, and the fragile decisions of people who are tired, frightened, or simply wrong. In this alternate history, the spark that sets the world ablaze comes not in the Caribbean during the Cuban Missile Crisis, nor in the White House Situation Room during the 1970s, but on the night of September 26, 1983, a date that in our timeline is remembered for the man who saved the world. Here he does not. In our history, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sits in a Soviet early warning bunker when alarms scream that American missiles are inbound. He hesitates, suspects a glitch, and breaks protocol by not relaying the alert up the chain. His doubt buys humanity its continued existence. In this world, Petrov is not at his post. He has been sent home with a fever, replaced by a junior officer whose career has been defined by rigid adherence to orders and a belief that the Americans are always on the brink of attack. The officer sees the data, 5 Minuteman ICBMs streaking towards Soviet territory, and reacts exactly as the manuals instruct. He reports it as a confirmed launch. Moscow receives the call in the dim-lit corridors of the General Staff, where a sleepless Politburo is already jittery from months of rising tensions. NATO's Able Archer exercises have been interpreted as a possible cover for a nuclear first strike. Soviet reconnaissance satellites have been detecting unusual activity at U.S. missile silos in the Midwest. The General Secretary, already convinced that Washington is maneuvering for advantage, listens to his generals explain that if they delay, their command and control network could be decapitated. The decision is made in under 4 minutes. Orders are transmitted to launch. Deep beneath the forests of the Urals and the plains of Kazakhstan, massive steel blast doors slide open. Rocket engines ignite, turning the darkness into roaring pillars of fire. R-36 and UR-100 ICBMs claw their way into the sky, their payloads of megaton warheads arcing toward the United States, Western Europe, and key NATO command centers. In the North Atlantic and beneath Arctic ice, Soviet ballistic missile submarines receive their coded authorization and begin launching their own salvos. On the other side of the planet, NORAD's radars pick up the launches within minutes. The American president is rushed from a late-night briefing in the Oval Office to the secure command post beneath the White House. The options presented to him are brutally simple: retaliate immediately or risk losing the U.S. arsenal on the ground. The logic of mutually assured destruction, designed to prevent this very moment, now drives it forward. The president authorizes a full-scale counterstrike. U.S. Minuteman and Peacekeeper missiles lift from their silos, their vapor trails painting white scars across the pre-dawn skies of the Great Plains. Trident submarines hidden in the Atlantic and Pacific unleash their payloads, each missile carrying multiple independently targetable warheads aimed at Soviet military sites, industrial hubs, and cities. Bombers scramble from bases in North America, some carrying nuclear gravity bombs, others armed with air-launched cruise missiles intended to penetrate Soviet air defenses. The first warheads detonate over military installations and airfields, but within the hour, cities begin to vanish. Washington, D.C., and New York are obliterated. Moscow disappears in a blossom of light that turns night into day over 1,000 kilometers away. London, Paris, Warsaw, and Bonn follow. In China, caught between its own nuclear arsenal and the fear of being targeted, the leadership launches a limited strike against both U.S. and Soviet forces, hoping to avoid annihilation but instead drawing retaliatory fire from both sides. The chain reaction spreads beyond the superpowers. Pakistan and India, long at odds, seize the chaos as an opportunity to settle their own disputes, unleashing regional nuclear exchanges that kill tens of millions. Israel, fearing an existential strike from hostile neighbors, launches preemptively on perceived threats in the Middle East. The world map becomes a constellation of mushroom clouds. Within 12 hours, more than 5,000 nuclear detonations have occurred across the globe. Hundreds of millions are dead outright. Hundreds of millions more are fatally injured, trapped in burning cities or dying from radiation exposure. Fires consume forests, industrial zones, and oil fields, pumping black carbon into the upper atmosphere where it will block the sun for years. The concept of tomorrow is suddenly stripped of meaning for most of humanity. And yet, in these first hours, even as the machinery of destruction spins out of control, the survivors in bunkers and shelters do not yet understand that the real enemy to come is not the opposing ideology, nor the soldiers with guns, but the sky itself, darkening with the soot of 1,000 infernos. The first strikes fell with mathematical precision. NATO and Warsaw Pact military planners had spent decades mapping each other's vital organs, command centers, missile silos, airfields, and ports, until the list of targets became a kind of morbid scripture. When the orders came, the missiles did not fly blind. They flew with purpose, guided by decades of reconnaissance, espionage, and satellite imagery. In Western Europe, the early morning sky over Germany was torn apart by the shriek of air raid sirens. Bundeswehr units scrambled to man anti-air batteries, but most never had a chance to fire. Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range missiles arrived in waves, detonating over Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Hamburg, their fireballs erasing entire districts in seconds. NATO's own Pershing II missiles answered almost instantly, targeting East German and Polish air bases. But even as they launched, incoming strikes turned much of the Ruhr industrial basin into a churning sea of flame. London's reprieve lasted less than an hour. A Soviet submarine lurking in the North Sea surfaced long enough to launch its final salvo before slipping back into the depths. 3 warheads struck, one obliterating Whitehall and the Palace of Westminster, another leveling Heathrow and the surrounding boroughs, and a third vaporizing Docklands along the Thames. The shockwave rolled through the city like the breath of a giant, flattening streets and shattering glass for miles. Survivors stumbled through choking dust, deafened by the blast and blinded by the glare of fires that consumed entire blocks. Paris, Brussels, Rome, and Madrid followed in quick succession. In the east, Warsaw and Prague were gutted by NATO strikes. Their government buildings, rail hubs, and military headquarters turned to rubble beneath towering columns of smoke. Warsaw Pact air defense networks, already frayed by the speed and scale of the attack, failed to intercept more than a fraction of the incoming cruise missiles. The Mediterranean became a graveyard for fleets. U.S. Sixth Fleet carrier groups exchanged fire with Soviet naval forces in a brutal series of engagements off the coasts of Italy and Greece. Nuclear depth charges turned stretches of sea into boiling voids, annihilating submarines in seconds, but leaving radioactive scars that would poison marine life for decades. The Strait of Gibraltar, a choke point for both military and commercial traffic, was closed within hours as fires raged on both the Spanish and Moroccan coasts. Civilians across the continent tried to flee, but the roads clogged instantly. Refugee convoys became targets for opportunistic airstrikes or collateral damage from nearby detonations. Trains packed with desperate passengers vanished in incandescent flashes as missiles struck rail yards and bridges. The European countryside, once a patchwork of farms and towns, was pitted with smoking craters, its rivers choked with ash and debris. In the far north, Norway's fjords echoed with the roar of low-flying bombers. Soviet backfire and Bear aircraft attempted to cut NATO's northern resupply routes, striking ports at Narvik and Tromsø, while U.S. forces in Iceland returned fire, reducing Murmansk to rubble in an effort to cripple the Soviet Northern Fleet. The Arctic sky glowed with auroras that had nothing to do with the magnetosphere, strange shimmering curtains of light created by nuclear detonations over the polar atmosphere. Across the Atlantic, the eastern seaboard of the United States was already a wasteland. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. were gone, replaced by sprawling firestorms feeding on every combustible material in reach. In Canada, Montreal and Ottawa were hit directly, while fallout from strikes on U.S. cities drifted northward, coating farmland in a thin, deadly layer of radioactive dust. Military command structures fractured. Some NATO and Warsaw Pact units found themselves cut off from orders entirely, acting on standing directives or improvising in the chaos. Field commanders ordered strikes based on outdated intelligence, destroying cities that had already been annihilated hours earlier. Retaliatory spirals played out on regional scales. Turkey struck Soviet positions in Armenia, prompting counterstrikes that devastated Ankara and Istanbul. Greece and Bulgaria traded nuclear blows. Even Finland, officially neutral, saw detonations near Helsinki as Soviet forces tried to prevent NATO infiltration from the north. In the chaos of the first blows, the war revealed its true nature. Not a controlled exchange of limited nuclear fire, but a cascading collapse of all the systems that defined modern civilization. Power grids failed almost instantly under the electromagnetic pulses from high-altitude detonations. Radios hissed with static as communication satellites went dark. Air traffic controllers lost contact with aircraft mid-flight, leaving hundreds of planes to run out of fuel and crash in remote forests or open seas. The The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical destruction. Decades of Cold War rhetoric had promised annihilation, but the reality was beyond anything the mind could hold. Survivors in the basements of apartment blocks or the tunnels of subway systems emerged to find familiar skylines replaced by infernos, their streets unrecognizable under layers of ash and twisted metal. Children clung to parents who could not explain why the sun had gone dim behind an unnatural veil of smoke. By the third day, the majority of the Northern Hemisphere's major population centers had been hit. The concept of front lines dissolved into a general landscape of ruin. There were no safe zones, only places not yet targeted, and those were shrinking fast. The first waves of radiation sickness began to appear: nausea, hair loss, bleeding gums, fevers that turned into death sentences. Hospitals, where they still stood, overflowed within hours and then ceased functioning altogether as supplies ran out and medical staff succumbed to the same conditions as their patients. For those who still had the capacity to think beyond the next hour, the grim realization set in. The war was no longer about victory or defeat. The structures that had divided East and West were irrelevant now. The only question left was who, if anyone, would survive the world they had just destroyed. By the time the first week drew to a close, the Cold War's transformation into a hot war had left no continent untouched. The exchange between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, though catastrophic, was only the opening act in a chain reaction of fear, miscalculation, and opportunism that rippled outward until every regional fault line in the world erupted in fire. In Asia, the Soviet Union's vast eastern territories had not escaped unscathed. American Trident submarines lurking in the Pacific had loosed warheads on Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and key missile bases in the Russian Far East. The Japanese home islands, though initially spared in the belief that they might serve as a forward logistics hub for any surviving U.S. forces, were drawn in when Soviet forces, misinterpreting maritime movements near Hokkaido as the staging of an American amphibious assault, targeted Tokyo and Osaka. The blasts obliterated infrastructure, killed millions, and left the survivors struggling against firestorms that consumed entire wards of the cities in hours. China's entry into the conflict had been hesitant at first, but in the chaos of the European theater, Chinese leadership feared that neutrality would invite vulnerability. As Soviet and American missiles arced over the polar regions, Beijing ordered strikes on both to cripple any possibility of encirclement. The retaliation was swift and merciless. U.S. warheads rained down on Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, while Soviet salvos flattened Harbin and Chengdu. Entire provinces became silent, but for the low moan of burning winds. The Korean peninsula became a flashpoint in miniature. North Korea, interpreting the global exchange as the ultimate breakdown of restraint, launched a massive artillery barrage and missile assault on Seoul, attempting to unify the peninsula under cover of global chaos. The South responded in kind, aided by what remained of U.S. forces in the Pacific, but within days both halves of Korea were reduced to charred ruins, their armies bleeding out in irradiated hills and shattered cities. In the Middle East, decades of unresolved hostility ignited in an instant. Israel, believing it faced an existential threat from neighboring states in the confusion, executed a full-scale preemptive nuclear strike on Damascus, Cairo, Tehran, and Baghdad. Syria and Egypt collapsed immediately. Iran and Iraq, each possessing limited nuclear capabilities, struck back. The Gulf states, caught between fallout clouds and collapsing oil infrastructure, saw their cities emptied in desperate evacuations toward increasingly inhospitable deserts. The Strait of Hormuz, once the artery of global oil trade, became an irradiated graveyard of tankers and warships. South Asia was no less violent. India and Pakistan, whose decades of border skirmishes had simmered under the shadow of the superpowers, saw in the nuclear chaos an opportunity to settle their conflict over Kashmir once and for all. The exchange began with tactical strikes along the line of control, but quickly escalated to full-scale nuclear bombardment of each other's capitals and major cities. By the time the dust settled, if settled, could be applied to the ash clouds curling overhead, over 100 million people had perished in less than a week. Africa's experience was shaped less by direct strikes than by the collapse of global systems. South Africa, still under apartheid, possessed the means to deliver nuclear weapons but refrained, instead sealing its borders and mobilizing internally. North Africa, however, absorbed the indirect consequences of Europe's destruction. Mediterranean fallout spread across Morocco, Algeria, and Libya, poisoning crops and water supplies. In East Africa, where ports had once been vital nodes in the Indian Ocean trade, the sudden absence of global shipping created famine within weeks. Nations that had never been targeted directly found themselves dying from starvation, disease, and the slow, invisible drift of radiation. South America initially seemed poised to stand apart from the madness. The superpowers had few strategic interests there in the early days of the war, but neutrality proved impossible. Brazil and Argentina, wary of each other's intentions and fearful that one might ally with surviving U.S. naval groups, began a regional arms race that ended with Brazilian jets dropping nuclear gravity bombs on Buenos Aires, followed by Argentine missiles striking Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Chile, Peru, and Venezuela saw coups, civil wars, and anarchy blossom in the vacuum of collapsing international trade. The oceans themselves became killing fields. Merchant shipping all but ceased as navies turned to unrestricted warfare, sinking any vessel suspected of carrying supplies for an enemy. Nuclear detonations at sea boiled thousands of square kilometers of water, creating dead zones where fish floated belly up in poisoned swells. Fallout carried on prevailing winds began to circle the globe, a slow-moving shroud that paid no attention to borders, alliances, or ideology. In Antarctica, where scientific outposts once represented fragile cooperation between nations, the war's effects were felt in eerie silence. Ice cores and weather stations recorded a rapid increase in atmospheric particulates, confirming the onset of what climatologists had long feared, nuclear winter. Temperatures began to drop across the globe as sunlight dimmed, trapped behind a veil of soot high in the stratosphere. Growing seasons shortened within weeks, and those who had survived the blasts began to understand that their greatest challenge lay not in the ruins of war, but in the barren years to come. By the end of the second week, more than half of the human race was dead. The survivors were scattered, leaderless, and surrounded by a world that no longer obeyed the rules of their past. No continent had been spared, no ocean remained safe. The Cold War had indeed turned hot, but the firestorm it unleashed was not the work of two superpowers alone. It was the sum of every fear, grudge, and ambition that humanity had carried into the nuclear age. And now, with the last coordinated strikes fading into silence, the war had entered a new phase, a slow, grinding descent into a planet-wide struggle for survival. When the last coordinated salvos burned themselves out, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the absence of everything that had made peace possible. No functioning governments, no intact supply chains, no certainty that any order could be restored. The map of the world had been redrawn not by diplomacy or conquest, but by fire and ash. In the capitals that had survived the initial strikes, leadership was often reduced to a handful of exhausted officials huddled in bunkers. They emerged into a reality they could neither control nor comprehend. Moscow's command posts were vaporized. Washington's political leadership, fragmented and scattered, attempted to communicate via damaged satellite relays and hardened radio links. But most of those systems were dead or degraded beyond repair. London's continuity government was buried under tons of rubble. Beijing's chain of command was fractured into regional warlordism. The nation, as a political and functional entity, had ceased to exist in much of the world. The first wave of collapse was logistical. In cities that had escaped direct hits, food supplies ran out in days. Without functioning transportation networks, there was no way to move grain from rural silos to urban centers. Fuel shortages rendered trucks and trains useless. Electricity grids, crippled by electromagnetic pulses and physical destruction, remained dark. Without refrigeration, what little perishable food remained rotted quickly. Water treatment plants failed, and rivers filled with ash and decaying bodies became breeding grounds for disease. The second wave was social. Police forces, where they still existed, found themselves outnumbered by desperate mobs. Armories were raided, The distinction between soldier and civilian blurred as everyone armed themselves with whatever could be found. Looting began as an act of survival: food, water, medicine. But soon spread to weapons, fuel, and even luxury goods, symbols of a world that had already slipped away. Violence was no longer a breakdown of order, it became the default state. Refugees moved in great tides across ruined landscapes. Some traveled on foot, others on bicycles or in scavenged vehicles, pushing carts piled high with whatever could be carried. Highways became graveyards of stalled traffic, their lanes blocked by burned-out cars and the skeletal remains of those who had died in place. The old lines between friend and foe dissolved. Survival was determined not by nationality, but by the small circles of trust that could be maintained. In rural areas, the absence of centralized authority produced different outcomes. Some villages barricaded themselves, sharing resources and turning away outsiders. Others dissolved into chaos as local leaders seized control and enforced loyalty through violence. Bands of armed survivors, part militia, part marauder, roamed the countryside, raiding farms and small towns for supplies. The fear of strangers became as lethal as radiation. Fallout spread unpredictably, carried by winds that no longer followed the rhythms of the seasons. In some places, invisible death arrived without warning. In others, contaminated zones became grim sanctuaries, avoided by all but the most desperate. Makeshift Geiger counters, scavenged from ruined labs or repurposed from industrial equipment, became as valuable as food. Those without them walked blind into danger. In the absence of governments, new forms of authority emerged. Some were built around surviving military units, disciplined, heavily armed, but with finite supplies and increasingly desperate soldiers. Others were religious in nature, framing the catastrophe as divine judgment and promising salvation in exchange for obedience. In a few rare cases, democratic councils formed, cobbled together from surviving officials, community leaders, and skilled civilians, but these were fragile, constantly threatened by scarcity and the ambitions of stronger neighbors. The collapse of communication networks meant that even when communities wanted to coordinate, they could not. Shortwave radios became lifelines, their operators turning into de facto diplomats as they relayed news between distant enclaves. Messages were often outdated by the time they arrived, and rumors spread faster than facts. Tales of entire countries untouched by the war, of ships carrying survivors to safe islands, of underground cities with limitless food and clean air. Most were false, but hope, like fear, was hard to kill. The global economy, already a memory, was replaced by a barter system rooted in survival. Ammunition, medicine, and clean water became the currencies of the new world. Gold and paper money were useless, though some still hoarded them as relics, reminders of a civilization that had once measured value in symbols rather than survival. The skills that mattered most were no longer those of bankers, lawyers, or politicians, but of farmers, mechanics, and doctors, if any were still alive to practice their crafts. For many, the hardest loss to bear was not material, but psychological. The war had not simply destroyed cities. It had severed the connection to history, the sense that humanity was moving forward towards something better. Libraries and archives were gone. Universities lay in rubble. The great narratives of progress, democracy, and ideology had evaporated in mushroom clouds. People no longer asked who had won the war. They asked if there was anyone left to tell the story of what had been lost. In the shadow of this collapse, one truth became clear. Survival was no longer about nations, flags, or even alliances. It was about the fragments of humanity that could be preserved from the wreckage, the skills, the memories, the fragile bonds between people. The Cold War had been fought over the idea of the future, but in this new reality, the future was not a political ideal. It was a question whispered over dying fires. Can we last until the next sunrise? And as the smoke thickened and the nights grew colder, even that question became harder to answer. By the second month, the nuclear winter had stopped being a temporary crisis in people's minds. It had become the new world. The sky remained a bruise of gray-black, the sun little more than a faint smudge behind an endless shroud. The cold was constant now, a steady weight on the bones, But it was hunger that truly hollowed the survivors. The first wave of starvation struck the cities that had escaped direct hits but were cut off from supply lines. At first, there had been looting of supermarkets, warehouses, and restaurants. But those reserves, already dwindling from panic, lasted only days. Flour turned rancid. Rice sacks burst in damp storage rooms. Rats became a common sight, feeding on what humans could not guard. Soon, the rats themselves became food. In some places, this was a grim transition. Traps set, meat boiled into thin stews. In others, it was not enough. In rural areas, the illusion of plenty evaporated just as quickly. The cold and the dim light stunted crops before harvest. Those stored in silos and barns were quickly seized by armed groups or shared until there was nothing left. Livestock perished in the freezing air, their carcasses butchered for meat that spoiled too quickly without refrigeration. Even grain-rich farmlands became barren when the soil froze and the wind stripped it bare. Hunger changed people. It sharpened instincts but dulled compassion. A neighbor who had been an ally one week could become a rival the next, their eyes lingering too long on your dwindling sack of grain. Entire settlements fractured over accusations of hoarding. Families fled in the night, carrying their last stores of food into the wilderness, hoping to find refuge elsewhere. A new kind of power emerged, food lords. In the absence of governments, those who controlled food became the new kings, warlords, and chieftains. Some were remnants of organized military units that had seized warehouses or silos early in the collapse. Others were bandits who had amassed stores through raiding and intimidation. Their power was enforced with armed followers who themselves were fed just enough to remain loyal. Communities would swear fealty in exchange for a share of grain, dried meat, or scavenged cans. Barter replaced currency entirely. Ammunition, medicine, and warm clothing were traded for food, but the exchange rates were cruel. A box of antibiotics could be worth a month's rations. A single bullet could cost you your next meal. Many traded away family heirlooms, jewelry, and keepsakes for a handful of beans or a stale loaf of bread. Objects that had once been priceless reduced to nothing but bargaining chips in the economy of desperation. In the shadows of this economy, rumors spread of black harvesters, groups who raided mass graves, not for valuables, but for the flesh of the dead. Cannibalism, at first whispered as a rare horror, became a reality in the most desperate enclaves. Those who crossed this line rarely returned to normal communities. Hunger had changed them too profoundly, making them feared as much as they were despised. A few communities resisted the slide into brutality. They organized carefully managed food distribution, rationing equally, and enforcing rules to prevent theft. These rare enclaves relied on cooperation, trust, and shared labor. Greenhouses powered by salvaged generators or heated with scavenged fuel grew small but vital crops: potatoes, beans, hardy greens. Fish farms, constructed from scavenged tanks and fed by stored grain, kept a trickle of protein in their diets. But even these fragile oases faced constant threats from raiders and from the slow exhaustion of their resources. Travel became both more dangerous and more necessary. Scouts ventured into the wasteland to search for unlooted stores, abandoned homes, and rural silos overlooked in the chaos. Most did not return. Those who did brought back meager finds: half-spoiled grain, a box of canned goods hidden behind a wall, the meat of a frozen deer caught by chance. Every return was both a victory and a reminder of how little remained. The hunger was not just physical. It gnawed at the mind, clouding judgment and draining willpower. Sleep became fitful. Dreams were filled with visions of banquets, warm bread, ripe fruit. Conversations circled endlessly around food: what had been eaten, what could be eaten, what might still be out there. People forgot the taste of sweetness, of salt, of spice. Meals became functional, joyless affairs, measured not in satisfaction, but in how many hours they could stave off the emptiness. Winter tightened its grip, and with it came the realization that the hunger would not end with the thaw, because there might never be a thaw. Scientists, when they could speak over the crackle of shortwave radios, warned that the soot in the atmosphere could take years to settle. The Earth's growing season had been shattered, perhaps permanently. Those who listened to these broadcasts felt their hope harden into something else: not despair, but a colder, more enduring instinct to endure at any cost. In this new world, hunger was more than a condition. It was the law, the judge, and the executioner. It shaped the new hierarchies, the new wars, and the new betrayals. It was the force that decided who lived, who died, and who became something less than human in the struggle to remain alive. And as the long hunger stretched on, it began to rewrite not just the rules of survival, but the nature of what it meant to be human at all. In the age before the war, fire had been a tool, a comfort on cold nights, a centerpiece for gatherings, a symbol of home. After the bombs fell, it became something else entirely. Fire was survival. It was warmth in a world gone bitterly cold. It was the difference between waking in the morning and being found frozen stiff beneath your blanket. It was light in a darkness that no longer ended with dawn. And because of that, fire became the most fought-over resource in the new age. The first winter after the nuclear exchange was not like any winter humanity had ever endured. The soot-thick sky dulled the sun into a pale, ghostly disk, leaving the Earth in an almost perpetual dusk. Temperatures plummeted, and without electricity or fuel deliveries, heaters and furnaces went cold. Those who had stockpiled would burn through it quickly. Furniture, doors, floors, anything that could be fed to the flames, was torn apart and sacrificed to the fire. But what was finite? Once it was gone, people turned to other fuels. Books, clothing, tires, even plastic. These burned dirty, filling shelters with acrid smoke. But the choking air was preferable to freezing to death. In the cities, the air hung heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and the faint, metallic tang of scorched metal. In the countryside, whole forests vanished in weeks, stripped bare until the horizon looked like a graveyard of blackened stumps. Fire itself became dangerous. A blaze too large could draw unwanted attention, raiders, scavengers, or desperate neighbors willing to kill for warmth. The glow of flames, once a welcoming sign, was now a beacon of vulnerability. Communities learned to conceal their fires, burning in deep pits or behind makeshift barriers to mask the light. Control over fuel became a form of power. Those who had secured coal stockpiles, access to natural gas, or caches of preserved firewood ruled their territories like feudal lords. They demanded labor, weapons, or food in exchange for heat. In some places, this control was enforced with brutal efficiency. Families denied fire unless they swore loyalty to the fuel master. In others, leadership was more cooperative, with shared burning stations where everyone took turns feeding the flames. But even in the most generous settlements, the fuel was measured to the smallest handful. The struggle for warmth shaped every decision. Travel was dangerous not just because of raiders or fallout, but because the cold could kill before any enemy could. Wanderers wrapped themselves in layers of scavenged clothing, wool, leather, even scraps of insulation ripped from walls. Those without adequate gear froze within hours. Bodies stiff with frostbite lay in ditches and snowbanks, sometimes within sight of the settlements they had been trying to reach. The cold made work slow and painful. Metal tools stuck to skin. Water froze solid in minutes if left uncovered. Without warmth, engines refused to turn over, batteries drained faster, and weapons jammed. For many, the only hours of productivity came in the brief windows when the fire was roaring. The psychological effect of the cold was as dangerous as the physical. Prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures brought on exhaustion, confusion, and despair. People became quieter, slower, more willing to give up. Fires weren't just for warmth. They were for morale, a flickering proof that life could still be pushed back against the darkness. To lose the fire was to lose hope. Some survivors adapted by going underground. Old mines, subway tunnels, and bunkers became warm havens for those who could seal themselves away from the wind. In these places, fires could burn constantly without fear of detection, their smoke vented through carefully disguised chimneys. But living underground came with its own costs: stale air, cramped conditions, and the creeping mental strain of never seeing the sky. Others learned to hoard heat. Stones were placed near fires during the day, then wrapped in cloth and carried to bed at night. Water was heated and stored in metal cans to act as makeshift radiators. Homes were sealed off into single rooms to conserve warmth, with families huddled together under layers of blankets. body heat supplementing the flames. Despite the dangers, fire also became a rare symbol of defiance. In some settlements, there were great burnings, bonfires lit not for necessity, but for ritual. They were dangerous acts, visible for miles, but they served as declarations. We are still here. We still claim this place. At these fires, stories were told, songs sung, and for a few hours, the world before the war flickered back into being. But when the embers died and the cold crept back in, reality returned. In the new world, fire was never truly tamed. It was too precious, too rare, too costly to keep alive for long. It demanded constant feeding, constant vigilance, constant fear of losing it. And so, the survivors lived by an unspoken truth. The fires that never die are the ones you guard with your life. Because in the endless winter left behind by the war, when the last flame goes out, so too does everything else. By the end of the first year, the chaos that had followed the bombs began to take shape into something colder and more organized. In the burned-out shells of cities, in the gutted farmlands and abandoned military outposts, figures rose who understood a simple truth. In the ashes of the old world, survival was not enough. Power had to be seized, guarded, and wielded. These were the Lords of the Ash, warlords, chieftains, and strongmen who ruled over scraps of territory with the same ruthlessness that empires once ruled continents. Their origins varied. Some were former military officers who had retained control over armed units in the aftermath, using their training and discipline to carve out domains. Others had been gang leaders or organized crime bosses before the war, their brutality and instinct for control perfectly suited to the new lawless order. A few were simply survivors who had acted quickly in the chaos, seizing warehouses, securing fuel depots, or controlling key wells, then using those assets to build followings. What united them was their mastery of scarcity. In this new world, the only currencies were food, heat, water, and security. The Lords of the Ash controlled at least one of these absolutely, and often two or more. A warlord with a cache of canned goods could buy loyalty for months. One with a coal stockpile could make entire settlements kneel. Their power was enforced not through laws, but through the simple calculation every survivor made. Defy them, and you freeze, starve, or die at the hands of their enforcers. Each domain was different in character. Some were fortified enclaves in the ruins of cities, with barricades built from cars and rubble, watchtowers manned by armed sentries, and strict entry controls. Others were nomadic war bands, moving constantly to strip resources from abandoned towns before rivals arrived. There were river lords who controlled crossings and water routes, extracting tolls in food or fuel. In the north, there were coal barons who ruled over the last functioning mines, their camps lit by a constant, defiant glow in the endless night. The rule of the Lords of the Ash was rarely benevolent. Taxation came in the form of tribute, crops, scavenged goods, or forced labor. In some domains, entire families were required to work for weeks in frozen fields or hauling supplies simply to keep their place by the fire. Punishments were swift and brutal. Thieves lost hands, deserters were executed publicly, and those who challenged the Lord's authority were either banished into the wasteland or crucified on the edges of the territory as a warning. Still, for many survivors, life under a lord was preferable to life without one. The Lords of the Ash, for all their cruelty, provided something the wilderness could not: order. In their territories, food was rationed, however sparingly, fires were guarded, and raiders were kept at bay. In some rare cases, these rulers even organized scavenging expeditions, rebuilt defensive walls, and established crude marketplaces where trade could happen under watchful eyes. Competition between lords was constant and bloody. Alliances formed and shattered in weeks, and borders shifted with each raid or skirmish. Armies were small but fierce, often no more than a few dozen hardened fighters equipped with salvaged weapons and makeshift armor. Battles were quick, brutal affairs. Ambushes in ruined streets, night assaults on weakly defended outposts, sudden strikes on fuel convoys. The defeated were absorbed into the victor's domain, their resources seized, their people enslaved or relocated. Rumors of a High Council of Ash began to circulate, a supposed gathering of the most powerful warlords, meeting in secret to divide territories and avoid mutual destruction. Whether this council truly existed or was a story told to give the chaos some shape, no one knew. What was certain was that a few warlords grew far stronger than others, ruling territories large enough to be called kingdoms in all but name. In these larger realms, something resembling governance began to emerge. Ledgers were kept, crude lists of food stores, weapon inventories, and able-bodied fighters. Taxes were collected regularly rather than sporadically. Patrols kept roads clear of bandits, though only within the Lord's reach. In the shadows of these harsh regimes, black markets thrived, run by smugglers who could move goods between rival domains at great personal risk. The Lords of the Ash were not eternal. A bad harvest, a failed raid, or a successful assassination could end a reign overnight. Some were overthrown by their own captains, others starved alongside their followers when resources ran out. But their existence marked a turning point in the post-war world, the moment when survival alone was no longer enough, and domination became the true measure of power. For the scattered, frightened survivors, the choice was stark. Bend the knee to a Lord of the Ash, or take your chances in the frozen wastes where hunger, cold, and roving death waited without mercy. And for those who chose to serve, life became a constant balancing act. Loyalty measured against opportunity, obedience against the faint hope of escape. Because in the ashes of the old world, no one ruled forever. And when a lord fell, the scramble for his throne began before the embers of his final fire had cooled. In the old world, roads had been arteries of life. Asphalt and concrete stitched together nations, carried goods across continents, and linked families, cities, and cultures. Now, in the wake of the war, they were ghost veins, cracked and broken, stretching into a world that no longer pulsed with movement. The wind swept over them in a constant low moan, carrying the smell of ash and decay. Survivors called them the silent roads, for on most days, nothing moved upon them but dust. Travel along these roads was both a necessity and a gamble. They offered the fastest routes between territories, but also the most dangerous. Without maintenance, bridges sagged or collapsed entirely, leaving yawning gaps over frozen rivers. Potholes became craters, filled with ice and snow that could swallow a wheel hole. Weeds and frost worked together to split the pavement apart, creating jagged ridges that could tear through tires or snap an axle. But the real danger was human. Every road was a hunting ground. Raiders lay in wait in the ruins of gas stations and rest stops, hidden behind overturned trucks or in the shadows of collapsed overpasses. Snipers chose high vantage points to watch the roads for travelers, patient enough to wait hours for a target. The Lords of the Ash posted sentries along key stretches of road, extracting tolls in food, fuel, or ammunition. Travelers who could not pay might be stripped of supplies, or simply disappear. Even without human threats, the silent roads were littered with reminders of the day the old world ended. Rusting car carcasses stood bumper to bumper in frozen traffic jams, their drivers long dead, their possessions scavenged or left to rot. Some had become makeshift graves, the skeletons within wrapped in blankets as if in sleep. The interiors of these vehicles were stripped bare of anything useful. Seat covers cut for clothing, mirrors taken for signaling, batteries removed for any spark of life they could still give. Still, the roads carried the last remnants of trade. Smugglers, messengers, and traveling scavengers moved along them under cover of night, their carts and sledges silent against the frozen ground. Small caravans banded together for mutual protection, often under the temporary banner of a warlord or trade guild. These groups moved quickly, speaking little, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for trouble. If they made it to their destination, the goods they carried, dried meat, antibiotics, warm clothing, seeds, could mean survival for the people on the other end. There were rules for the silent roads, though they were not written anywhere. Travelers learned them by experience or died without knowing. Never linger in the open for too long. Never take the same route twice in a row. Never approach an abandoned vehicle without checking for movement beneath or within. Never carry more than you can afford to lose. And above all, never travel alone unless you are willing to gamble your life against the odds. The winter deepened, and the roads grew quieter still. Snow buried whole stretches, erasing the paths between settlements. Bridges became sheathed in ice so thick they groaned under even the lightest load. In some places, ice storms transformed the landscape into a labyrinth of frozen sculptures, where the wreckage of cars and road signs glittered like glass in the dim sun. It was beautiful, but beauty was a deadly distraction. Legends began to grow along the roads. There were stories of phantom convoys, long lines of trucks moving through the night with lights blazing, seen from a distance but vanishing when approached. Some claimed these were the ghosts of the last supply runs before the bombs fell, forever trapped in motion. Others spoke of the Black Toll, a group of road bandits so ruthless they left no survivors, taking not just goods but bodies, leaving behind nothing but bloody tire tracks in the snow. The silent roads were also the graveyard of the old supply chain. Fuel depots lay cracked open, their reserves long drained or frozen into useless sludge. Rest stops and diners were gutted for wood, metal, and insulation. Highway billboards, once bright with advertisements, now hung in tatters, their slogans unintentionally mocking the end of civilization. Always prepared. A warmer tomorrow. Your safety is our priority. In time, some roads became the domain of specific powers. Warlords claimed stretches as their own, fortifying bridges and choke points, painting their symbols on road signs to mark safe or unsafe passage. Traders paid these lords in goods or intelligence, whispering rumors of rival troop movements, newly discovered caches, or approaching storms. In return, they were sometimes granted armed escorts to ensure their cargo arrived intact. But outside these pockets of control, the silent roads remained lawless, stretching out like ribbons into the wasteland. Each step along them was a wager. You might reach a settlement where fires still burned and food was shared, or you might vanish without a trace. Just another story told in hushed voices by the next travelers to pass that way. The silent roads were more than paths. They were the last fragile connections between the scattered fragments of humanity. Without them, every settlement would have been an island, cut off entirely from the rest of the world. But they came with a price, and everyone who set foot upon them knew it. Survival here meant moving quickly, trusting no one, and never looking too long at the bodies that had already lost the bet you were now making. In the silence after the bombs, the old currencies died quickly. Paper money was tinder. Gold was heavy and useless against hunger. Digital wealth evaporated in the blink of an EMP. What mattered now was tangible survival. Food, fuel, medicine, ammunition, warm clothing, and tools. Out of this stripped-bare economy emerged a new breed of power, the barter kings. They were not kings in the old sense, but they ruled all the same. For in the wasteland, commerce was as deadly as war. The first barter kings were scavengers with sharp instincts. They learned quickly which goods were worth their weight in blood and which could be traded across territories without being stolen at the first checkpoint. Antibiotics became more valuable than diamonds. A box of .45 caliber rounds could buy a month's rations. Seeds for hardy crops were treasures guarded as tightly as ammunition stores. Clean water was both currency and weapon. Hoarded, rationed, and traded only to those who had something equally precious. The genius of the barter kings was their ability to move goods across the fractured map of post-war territories. The silent roads were their veins, the hidden trails and frozen rivers their capillaries. They memorized the shifting borders of the Lords of the Ash, knowing which sentries could be bribed, which roadblocks should be avoided entirely, and which commanders were desperate enough to trade steel for grain. They cultivated relationships with smugglers, scavengers, mercenaries, and even raiders, anyone who could help them get their goods from one dangerous point to another. Their caravans were small and fast, disguised to look less valuable than they were. Pack animals carried loads beneath patched tarps, sledges were camouflaged with snow and dirt, and wagons were reinforced with steel plates scavenged from wrecked cars. Armed guards traveled with them, but the barter kings valued speed and secrecy over heavy firepower. A battle could cost more in goods than it was worth. Better to disappear before an enemy even knew they were there. The trade hubs they used were not markets in the traditional sense. They were ruins repurposed for business, abandoned warehouses, half-collapsed malls, fortified barns on the outskirts of settlements. In these spaces, The barter kings operated under strict rules. Violence inside the market was punishable by exile or worse, for no one could afford to turn a trading post into a battlefield. Deals were struck in murmured tones, and trades were often completed in private rooms where only the buyer and seller knew the exact terms. The barter kings thrived because they understood value was not fixed. It shifted with need and season. A coat might be worth nothing in the summer, but in the dead of winter, it could buy enough food to last weeks. Salt could be traded for tools in one settlement, then traded again for fuel in another, finally ending its journey as payment for a doctor's services. A smart trader could turn a single item into 10 times its worth simply by moving it along the right route. But this power came at a cost. The barter kings were always hunted by raiders who wanted their goods, by rival traders eager to seize their routes, and by warlords who wanted to control the flow of resources entirely. Many barter kings traveled under false names, changing their appearance and moving their camps constantly. They kept multiple caches of goods hidden along their routes, so a single ambush wouldn't destroy their fortune. In time, the most successful barter kings became more than traders. They became information brokers. News traveled slowly in the wasteland, but the traders heard it all. Which settlements had fallen to famine, which warlords had forged new alliances, which scavenger bands had found an old military stockpile. They sold this information as carefully as they sold their goods, knowing that knowledge could be just as valuable and just as dangerous. Some barter kings built loose networks, forming alliances with other traders to pool resources and coordinate routes. These alliances were fragile, bound together by mutual benefit rather than loyalty. Betrayal was common, and trust was a currency rarer than any physical good. Yet, in a world where survival often meant access to goods from far away, the barter kings became indispensable. Even the most ruthless lords of the Ash had to deal with them, for without trade, their domains would wither. Over time, certain names became legendary along the silent roads. There was Coalface Marin, who controlled the winter fuel trade in the northern territories and could get you a ton of coal for the right price. Black Satchel Orin, who was said to carry every deal he'd ever made in a notebook no one had ever seen. And Red Lantern Mara, whose convoy always traveled with a single red light burning at the lead card, a warning and a promise to anyone who crossed her path. The barter kings were more than merchants. They were the threads that still stitched the world together. Without them, the territories would have collapsed into total isolation, each settlement cut off, each warlord ruling over a dying fiefdom. But as long as there were barter kings willing to take the risk, there was still a chance, a slim one, that something like civilization could flicker back to life in the ashes. Because in the frozen wreckage of the old world, trade was more than business. It was the last living heartbeat of human connection, and the barter kings were the ones keeping it alive, one dangerous deal at a time. In the smothering silence that followed the war, survival was not just a matter of food and fire. It was a matter of defense. Raiders, warlord enforcers, and desperate wanderers roamed the frozen land, each one a potential threat to whatever fragile stability a settlement had managed to build. Out of this constant danger, the winter militias emerged, not professional armies, but bands of citizen soldiers forged by necessity, bound together by the shared conviction that if they did not defend their homes, no one would. The early militias were clumsy and under-equipped. Farmers with old hunting rifles, welders with steel pipes, teenagers carrying kitchen knives strapped to broom handles. They wore what they could find: mismatched coats, ski masks, scarves pulled tight against the cold. But even this ragged defense was enough to deter the most opportunistic predators. A raider gang might risk one armed guard, but a dozen? That was a fight that could go badly, and badly meant dead. These militias were not born of trust in leaders. They were born of trust in each other. Small groups began by patrolling the outskirts of their settlements, keeping watch for suspicious movement. They learned to move silently across snow, to read tracks, to spot smoke from a distant camp. Some became adept at setting traps, hidden snares, tripwires that rang bells, sharpened stakes buried under loose snow where a charging attacker might fall. Over time, militias became more organized. They established shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake and watching the perimeter, no matter the hour. They scavenged weapons and ammunition from the ruins, trading with barter kings for spare parts or salvaging the remains of old armories. Those with military or law enforcement backgrounds trained the rest, teaching basic marksmanship, formation movement, and how to hold a defensive line under pressure. Leadership in the militias often fell to those who had proven themselves in action rather than those with political ambition. A woman who had stood her ground during a raid might become captain. A man who knew the forest paths better than anyone else became the scout leader. The militias were practical in this way. Respect was earned in the field, not claimed in a meeting. Yet, the winter militias were not purely defensive forces. When necessary, they struck first. If scouts reported that a raider camp was preparing for an attack, a militia might march in the dead of night to burn the camp before it could move. If a neighboring settlement was taken over by a warlord's enforcers, the militia might join forces with others to drive them out. Retaliation was often swift and brutal, because in this frozen world, leaving an enemy alive meant inviting them back with reinforcements. There were stories of legendary militia units that became symbols of resistance. The Frosthounds, who wore scavenged dogskin cloaks and moved in total silence until they struck. The Iron Skis, who patrolled on old cross-country skis, able to cross great distances over snow faster than any raiding party. The Black Line, a militia that defended a mountain pass so fiercely that no raider had made it through alive in over 2 years. But militias could be double-edged swords. In some cases, they grew too powerful, turning into the very tyrants they had once fought against. Leaders who had defended their people from raiders began demanding tribute, enforcing curfews, and ruling through fear. Some settlements that had welcomed militias as protectors later came to see them as occupiers. The line between guardian and oppressor was thin, and the winter had a way of erasing it altogether. Still, for many communities, the militia was the only thing standing between survival and destruction. The sight of a patrol returning from the perimeter brought a kind of relief that could not be measured in goods. Parents slept a little easier knowing someone was awake with a rifle. Fires burned longer when there were enough hands to guard them. The winter militias became part of the rhythm of life. New members were initiated with quiet, grim ceremonies, sometimes nothing more than being handed a weapon and told where to stand. They trained whenever resources allowed, often practicing in silence to conserve energy and avoid drawing attention. They maintained armories in hidden basements, where weapons were oiled and ammunition counted by candlelight. When the great blizzards came, the militias did not dissolve. They adapted. Patrols moved in pairs or not at all, relying on signals, lantern flashes, flares, coded knocks on doors to communicate. Snow became both enemy and ally. It muffled movement but also slowed attacks. The militias learned to read the snow's language, to see the difference between a deer trail and the staggered steps of an armed man trying to hide his presence. In a land where the state was gone, where borders had crumbled and law was a memory, the winter militias were the closest thing to a standing army. They were not glamorous, they were not gentle, and they were never far from the edge of brutality. But without them, the settlements would have been consumed long ago, swallowed by the endless night and the hunger that prowled within it. And so they endured, silent in the snow, rifles in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next shadow to emerge from the white. In the chaos after the war, information became the most dangerous currency. Food could keep you alive for a week, weapons could keep you alive for a month, but knowing what your enemies were planning could keep you alive indefinitely. Out of the fractured remains of the old intelligence agencies, criminal syndicates, and desperate opportunists, a new breed of power rose from the shadows, the shadow brokers. They had no uniforms, no flags, and no fixed territory. Their domain was the unseen. Whispers in the dark, coded notes tucked into hollowed-out books, rumors carried by traveling merchants. The shadow brokers dealt in secrets, and in a world where every wrong step could mean death, those secrets were worth more than gold had ever been. At first, the brokers were simply survivors who learned to listen. A scavenger who overheard a warlord's plans to raid a neighboring settlement could trade that information for safe passage or food. A trader who memorized the patrol schedules of a militia could use that knowledge to smuggle goods without detection. In time, These individuals began to see the true value of their skill, not in keeping information, but in selling it to the highest bidder. The networks they built were sprawling and decentralized. Couriers carried verbal messages between settlements, memorizing details so no written record could be intercepted. Dead drops became common. Hidden caches in tree hollows, under loose stones, or beneath frozen ponds, where messages or small items could be left for retrieval. In larger hubs, information was traded in coded form. A seemingly harmless market ledger might actually be a list of upcoming attacks. A song sung in a tavern might carry a hidden message in its lyrics. The shadow brokers were masters of anonymity. No one outside their inner circles knew their real names. They wore masks in meetings, used distorted voices when speaking in person, and often sent intermediaries to conduct deals on their behalf. A settlement might think it was dealing with a local gossip, never realizing that the words they heard were coming from a network that stretched across hundreds of miles. Their services were as varied as their clients. A militia captain might hire a broker to discover which of his men was secretly working for a rival faction. A barter king might pay for news of safe trade routes or the location of hidden fuel caches. Even warlords used brokers to spy on their enemies, sometimes without realizing that the same broker was feeding information to both sides. The brokers thrived in the cracks between power. They were neutral by necessity, selling to anyone who could pay, never taking sides unless it served their own interests. This neutrality made them both invaluable and dangerous. No one could truly trust them, but everyone needed them. Betrayal was always a possibility, but so was salvation. Their methods for gathering information were as creative as they were ruthless. Some recruited children as lookouts, their small size allowing them to slip into places adults could not. Others cultivated spies within enemy ranks, offering food or protection for their families in exchange for loyalty. A few used the oldest tricks in the book: blackmail, seduction, and the quiet knife in the dark when a loose tongue threatened to spill the wrong secret. The brokers also understood that information had a shelf life. A report on troop movements might be worthless within hours if the enemy changed plans. Thus, speed was as important as accuracy. They built relay systems of runners, riders, and even signal fires to move crucial intelligence quickly. In the depths of winter, when travel was hardest, they relied on coded broadcasts over scavenged radios, using old military frequencies few others could access. But being a shadow broker was not without risk. They were hunted relentlessly by those they had betrayed, by warlords who feared their influence, and by rival brokers seeking to eliminate competition. A captured broker rarely lived long. Their enemies wanted to silence them before they could reveal who they had been working for. Torture was common, and so was sudden, unexplained disappearance. And yet, the profession continued to attract new blood. For some, it was the promise of power. After all, in this broken world, a single whispered sentence could topple a warlord or save an entire settlement. For others, it was survival. Those who could not fight with weapons learned to fight with words and secrets instead. The most feared brokers were those whose names became legends. The Owl, said to see everything, whose network was so vast that no attack within 100 miles happened without her knowing. Gray Ledger, who kept records on everyone. Traitors, militia captains, even the Lords of the Ash, and could ruin a man with a single page of his hidden archives. The Voice, who never appeared in person, only speaking through radios or messengers, but whose information was always devastatingly accurate. To deal with a shadow broker was to accept a dangerous bargain. They could give you the truth that saved your life, or sell it to your enemy 5 minutes later. But in a world where ignorance was death, most were willing to take that risk. Because in the endless winter, power was not just about who had the most soldiers or the most guns. It was about who knew where those soldiers were marching and where those guns were pointed. And the shadow brokers always knew. When the snow came thick and the cold locked the land in its white prison, most settlements closed inward, surviving on whatever stores they had managed to gather. Travel was dangerous, hunting scarce, and the silent roads were stalked by raiders desperate enough to kill for a handful of grain. But in the heart of the long winter, something remarkable still happened. The long winter markets, ephemeral gatherings where the scattered pieces of the world came together under one fragile roof to trade, to talk, and to remember that humanity was still a single, tangled web. These markets were not fixed to a single place. They moved with the seasons, always appearing where the balance of safety, resources, and secrecy was most favorable. Sometimes they emerged in the shell of a burned-out factory. Other years they took over the frozen docks of an abandoned port town. On rare occasions, a winter market bloomed in the ruins of a pre-war city square, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and animal fat as hundreds of people converged from every direction. To reach one was no small feat. The locations were never announced openly. They were whispered along trader routes, hidden in coded signs, or passed by word of mouth through trusted contacts. Many traveled for days or weeks, braving blizzards, frozen rivers, and the ever-present risk of ambush. Arriving alive was its own kind of victory, a statement that you had earned your place among the living. The first sight of a winter market was unforgettable. Long rows of tents patched from every imaginable fabric. Army canvas, ship sails, shredded tarps, stood like teeth in the snow. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between them, their warm glow cutting the darkness. The air buzzed with 100 voices speaking a dozen dialects, and every few steps brought a different smell. Cooking stew, hot oil, tanned leather, smoke from pine logs, and the faint metallic tang of weapon oil. Inside the market, every kind of trade flourished. The barter kings were there, moving like predators among the stalls, their guards watchful and silent. Militia captains haggled for ammunition or spare parts. Farmers traded sacks of barley for medical supplies. Hunters laid out pelts and dried meat in neat rows. Blacksmiths hammered out crude but functional tools, their forges glowing red against the snow. There were stranger goods too, things that had little practical value but immense cultural weight. A cracked guitar, traded for a year's worth of preserved food because it reminded someone of their mother's voice. A faded photograph of a beach, swapped for a jar of sugar. Even in the depths of the apocalypse, people craved beauty, memory, and the illusion of normalcy. But the winter markets were more than trade hubs. They were political arenas. Alliances were forged in whispered conversations over shared bottles of strong drink. Old feuds were rekindled with a single glare across a tent. Spies from the shadow brokers' networks drifted through the crowd, collecting scraps of overheard plans. Warlords sent representatives to negotiate truces or to quietly threaten their rivals. Deals made here could change the fate of entire territories. The markets operated under strict rules. Violence was forbidden within their boundaries. Anyone who broke this law was dealt with swiftly, often dragged out into the snow and left for the wolves. This fragile peace was enforced by neutral guards, mercenaries hired from far-off settlements who owed allegiance to no single faction. Their armor was mismatched, their weapons varied, but their authority was absolute. Even the most notorious raider gangs knew better than to test them. Still, danger lingered. The journey home from a winter market was often more dangerous than the trip there. Raiders lay in wait along the roads, hoping to intercept traders laden with fresh goods. Some factions used the markets as traps, marking the faces of those they intended to rob later. The wisest traders kept their most valuable goods hidden until the final day, then left quietly under cover of night. Stories of the winter markets spread far beyond those who had seen them. Some called them the last true cities, places where the old world still flickered for a few short days. Others saw them as dangerous gatherings that only attracted trouble. But for those who walked through the crowded lanes, past the flickering lanterns and the sound of hammers on steel, they were proof that civilization was not yet dead, that even in the grip of an endless winter, people could still come together without killing each other. Every year, as the snow began to thaw, the markets dissolved. Tents were packed, fires doused, footprints erased. The gathering left nothing behind but a few charred fire pits and the memory of voices in the cold. By the time the next market was whispered into existence, its location and shape would be entirely new. In the end, the long winter markets were not just about trade or survival. They were about reminding the scattered survivors that they still belonged to a shared world. They were about the possibility, however faint, that one day the markets would not need to vanish, that they could become permanent settlements again, lit not by fear but by the steady warmth of community. For now, though, they were fleeting, beautiful, fragile, and utterly necessary. They were the ones who refused to scrape by in the ruins like the rest of the survivors. While most people scavenged enough to make it through the next week, the Lords of the Ash dreamed bigger. They did not see a wasteland. They saw a chessboard. Every broken settlement, every abandoned highway, every desperate soul was a piece to be moved, taken, or sacrificed. In the frozen aftermath of the war, when ash still drifted in the wind from cities burned beyond recognition, they rose, part kings, part predators, part executioners. The lords were not born into power. They took it. Each came from different origins. Some were former military officers with the discipline and ruthlessness to command troops. Others were gang leaders who had thrived in the chaos before the world collapsed. A few were simply survivors with a rare combination of cunning, charisma, and a willingness to do anything, no matter how brutal, to seize control. What united them was an instinct for exploiting weakness. Their territories were carved out in the same way they themselves had risen, through force, intimidation, and careful manipulation of resources. A lord might begin by controlling a single water source, forcing surrounding settlements to pledge loyalty in exchange for access. Another might seize a cache of pre-war weapons and use them to dominate the trade routes. The first rule of the lords was simple. Without control, you were prey. Every lord had their own style of rule. Some favored absolute terror, public executions, displays of corpses strung from makeshift gallows, patrols that treated even the smallest hint of dissent as rebellion. Others used a softer tyranny, offering protection and stability in exchange for taxes, labor, or obedience. In the cold logic of the wasteland, the difference between these two styles often meant nothing. Either way, a lord's will was law. Their strongholds were brutal fortresses built from whatever the world had left. Some occupied the husks of skyscrapers, their top floors fortified and their lower levels booby-trapped to deter intruders. Others took over factories, using the machinery to churn out weapons, armor, and tools for their loyalists. The most feared lords kept mobile bases, armored convoys that could vanish into the snow, leaving their enemies with nothing but an empty battlefield. To the common survivor, the Lords of the Ash were both a curse and a necessity. In a world where no central authority remained, they provided something resembling order. Roads under a lord's control were patrolled, settlements within their territory were defended from raiders, so long as tribute was paid. But their protection always came with chains, and those chains grew heavier with each passing season. The lords fought constantly among themselves, their ambitions too great to coexist peacefully. Skirmishes flared along disputed borders, and alliances shifted like wind-blown snow. A lord might swear loyalty to another for a year, then betray them the next, striking in the dead of night to seize their supplies. The shadow brokers thrived in this environment, feeding information to both sides and ensuring that no lord's power was ever truly secure. Their armies were not disciplined soldiers in the old sense. They were war bands, mixtures of mercenaries, conscripts, and fanatics. Some lords recruited from the desperate, offering food and shelter in exchange for service. Others took prisoners and gave them a choice: fight or die. In time, these forces became terrifying in their own right, capable of overwhelming militias and burning settlements to the ground in a single night. The most dangerous lords understood the power of symbols. They cultivated myth around themselves, turning their names into legends that traveled faster than their armies. There was the Black Wolf, who painted his face with soot before battle and was said to eat the hearts of his enemies. The Iron Widow, who ruled from a fortress lit by 100 oil drums and never appeared without her steel-plated mask. The Pale King, who wore white armor made from scavenged refrigerator doors and claimed to be chosen by the winter itself. Defiance was rare, but not impossible. Some settlements resisted a lord's rule long enough to form their own defense networks, aided by the winter militias or by rival lords seeking to weaken an enemy. When a lord fell, the collapse was often sudden and violent, their lieutenants turning on each other, their armies scattering, their strongholds looted within hours. But just as often, a new lord would rise from the ashes, the cycle beginning anew. The Lords of the Ash did not see themselves as villains. Many believed they were the only reason humanity still existed in the territories they ruled. And in a way, they were right. Without their control, chaos might have consumed everything. But their grip on power was never about rebuilding the world. It was about survival, dominance, and the cold satisfaction of knowing that in the Great Collapse, they had not only lived but risen above the rest. In the frozen wasteland, where the snow buried the past and the wind erased all names eventually, the Lords of the Ash carved their empires into the bones of the dead world. And until someone stronger came to take it from them, they ruled. It began without fanfare, so subtle that many mistook it for a trick of the light. After years of endless white and ash-gray skies, the snow on the southern slopes no longer stayed frozen through the day. Small rivulets of water began to trickle down through the ice, seeping into the blackened earth beneath. At first, people ignored it. Hope had been too dangerous for too long. But as the days passed, something undeniable happened. The cold began to loosen its grip. For generations of survivors born into the long winter, the idea of spring was a myth, a fragment of the old world carried in the half-remembered stories of elders. To them, spring was as alien as flight to a stone. But for the few who remembered the world before, who had smelled wet earth and heard the roar of rivers swollen with meltwater, the signs were impossible to mistake. The change was not sudden. The wind still bit like a knife, and storms still roared out of the north with enough fury to bury settlements in hours. But between them came warmer days, when the snow crust softened and the ice on old roads cracked underfoot. Birds returned first, small, ragged things, but alive. Their calls were strange to young ears and used to anything but the howling wind. Then came the smell, faint at first, but unmistakable, the scent of thawing soil, the breath of a world waking from too long a sleep. No one knew why it happened. Some whispered of shifts in the old climate cycles, long delayed by the smoke and ash of war, but now resuming their ancient rhythm. Others spoke of some great act of mercy from the earth itself, granting humanity one last chance. There were even those who credited the change to forces beyond nature, divine intervention, or perhaps the culmination of rituals kept alive in hidden places. Whatever the cause, it was not universal. In the far north, winter still reigned, and in the deep valleys choked by shadow, ice refused to melt. But across much of the fractured world, something was stirring. The first to act were the farmers. With seeds long hoarded in jars and cloth bundles, they moved to the newly bared patches of soil, scratching furrows with crude tools. It was risky. Any late frost could kill the fragile shoots, but the promise of fresh crops was too great to ignore. Old irrigation channels, long buried, were dug out again. Wells were deepened to tap into the softening groundwater. Communities that had lived on dried meat and roots for decades began to dream of green things. The long winter markets buzzed with new trades. Seed grain replaced bullets as the most valuable currency in some regions. Tools for plowing and planting appeared alongside the old wares of war. Even the barter kings shifted their focus, securing rights to the most fertile thawing lands and selling them for impossible prices. Not all welcomed the change. The Lords of the Ash had built their empires on scarcity, on controlling food, water, and fuel. A world that could feed itself threatened their dominance. In some territories, lords burned fields before they could be planted, claiming it was to prevent disease, but knowing it kept their subjects dependent. In others, they seized the thawed land outright, turning it into guarded estates worked by forced labor. Yet even they could not stop the thaw everywhere. The change was too wide, too persistent. The thaw also brought dangers long buried. Old diseases awoke from the melting permafrost, carried by runoff into rivers and wells. War debris, rusting tanks, chemical drums, unexploded shells, emerged from beneath the snow, poisoning the ground or killing the curious. And with the return of plant growth came the return of pests, small but relentless, capable of destroying a season's work in days. The survivors had to relearn skills their grandparents had once taken for granted: how to fence a garden, how to store grain without rot, how to keep water clean. Yet for all its risks, the thaw changed something deeper than the land. It changed the air in the settlements, the way people spoke to one another. The constant heaviness of winter was still there, but beneath it ran a current of possibility. Children began to play in the mud instead of the snow. Elders spoke more often of the past, describing in vivid detail the colors of flowers, the taste of fresh fruit, the sound of rain on leaves. For the first time in decades, people began to think of the future in more than days or weeks. The last spring, as it would later be called, was not the end of hardship. The cold returned in cycles, sometimes with a vengeance, as if reminding humanity not to grow too comfortable. But the memory of that first thaw became a seed in the minds of the living. A seed of defiance against the idea that the world was dead forever. In the years that followed, some would say the last spring was the turning point. Others would insist it was only a brief reprieve, destined to fade. But for those who were there, who saw the first green shoots pushing through the blackened soil, who felt the sun warm their faces without the sting of frost, it was proof that even the deepest winters end. And that was enough to begin again. Word count, 1 for 01. If you'd like, I can now wrap everything with the conclusion, tying together the survival, the rise and fall of powers, and the symbolic meaning of that thaw for the human story. Would you like me to proceed? When the war ended, there had been no victory, only survival. The old world collapsed into silence, and for a time it seemed that silence would be eternal. Winter sealed the ruins in ice, burying the memory of cities, of green fields, of rivers that ran free. In those first years, humanity clung to life like frost on broken glass, fragile, brittle, easily shattered. People spoke less of hope than of endurance, measuring their lives in meals and fires that lasted the night. And yet, in the shadow of that endless cold, something endured that was far harder to kill. Even as settlements fell to raiders, as the lords of the ash rose and fought over scraps of the old order, as disease and hunger culled the weak, people still found ways to trade, to tell stories, to keep the memory of spring alive. They gathered in the long winter markets not just to barter goods, but to remind themselves they were not alone. They whispered of lost lands and warmer days as if words themselves could bend the cold. The thaw, when it came, was not a miracle so much as a reminder that the earth itself had rhythms deeper than any empire's rise or fall. No matter how much ash was spread across the snow, no matter how long the ice held, the sun still knew its work. The last spring was not perfect. It brought dangers as well as promise, and its warmth was fragile. But it was enough. Enough to break the tyranny of inevitability. Enough to prove that even after the worst of endings, there could be another beginning. For some, the thaw meant power lost. The warlords who had built their rule on scarcity found their grip loosening. For others, it meant the first taste of freedom in a lifetime. The chance to grow food without tribute, to move without constant fear, to imagine a life beyond mere survival. Children born into the thaw learned the language of rivers and fields, words their parents had almost forgotten. If history survives, and it always does, in scraps and stories, then this time will be remembered not just for its cruelty, but for the strange resilience it revealed. The ashes will be remembered, yes, but so too will the thaw. For in the end, what defines humanity is not the winters we endure, but the springs we dare to believe in. The world will never be what it was before. Too much has been lost, too much buried under snow and ruin. But perhaps that is the point. The next world will be made by those who learn to live in the dark and still turn their faces toward the sun when it returned. And maybe that is enough.